So, my title is A Mode of Epithinking Leads Me to Exploring Vagueness and Finality. I've recently been concerned with a form of one of Hempel's two modes of explanation, the subsumption of phenomena under a covering law model. This form is the subsumption hierarchy. It's one of two known hierarchies, as shown here. This is a nesting of subclasses within classes, the subclasses having more informational constraints than the surrounding class. Such a hierarchy has what's called integrative levels. For example, using this form, we would explain heat energy produced while working as resulting from the second law of thermodynamics. We move logically from a particular in need of explanation to a more general phenomenon. In this example, we have it shown here. Here, a more generally present tendency in the universe is used to explain a more particular phenomenon. In the lower hierarchy, the biological model is shown to be a particular kind of chemical world, initiating constraints on chemistry, while chemistry is taken in turn to be one kind of physical world. Now, reading the other way, we can postulate a, we can,
Don't worry about it.
We can postulate causal connections, as in, we can change the wording now, the chemical world depends upon actions in the physical world, while the biological world depends upon chemical interactions. It is this going in the other direction that I'm concerned with here. So, nothing can come from or evolve out of a generalization as such. So, we need to think about how a general explanation, here it's the second law, can have an effect as a causal power. We need to change our perspective on it so that we can move in the opposite direction from explanation. In this way, following an unfolding of some effects of that law. In our example, the second law needs a material embodiment that would be operative causally anywhere. And here I venture, energy gradients are all intrinsically unstable and tend to dissipate. And of course, energy gradients are everything. This statement characterizes the physical world generally, which is far from thermodynamic equilibrium and full of energy gradients. In this world, dissipation is carried out as a diffusion of heat energy, that is, a spreading or contagion of molecular motion until its force is depleted by friction. Now, energy dissipating from a gradient can become causative if it can become concentrated in some way. Photosynthesis is a nice example where chemical reactions can be fostered by solar photons, resulting in a buildup of glucose, which serves as substrate for the ATP used in biological work, like cell division and muscle contraction. So we have the second law. Is this slide 3?
That's slide 2.
That's slide 3?
No, it's 2 still.
It's 2. Oh. Okay. I'm sorry, this little jerry-rigged setup.
That works. Don't worry. We're fine.
Is that slide 3?
That's slide 3.
Here we have the second law shown in a causative rather than an explanatory role. This requires further justification. An energy gradient could itself be causative only within a thermodynamically isolated system. It can be viewed as causative in our world because our section of the universe is clearly far from thermodynamic equilibrium. And I think the only reasonable assumption is that our universe is an isolated system. People argue about that. The second law in such a system calls for, it's a term I like to use, global thermodynamic equilibrium. Notice that in this view, energy gradient dissipation logically precedes energy flow utilization. That's important for origin of life considerations. In other words, what's happening as you move or anything is happening, the energy gradient is dissipating. You tap into it. It has recently been urged from observations on physical systems that the second law further calls for the most rapid dissipation of energy gradients possible under local constraints. This is known as the maximum entropy production principle. In this view, all energy gradients would explode if it were not for various constraints, like gravitation, chemical bonding, or the strong force holding them together. So now we have, as an amended causative statement of the second law, energy gradients are all intrinsically unstable and tend to dissipate as quickly as possible given local constraints. The second law cannot specify what routes among many possible in a natural setting that energy dissipations will follow, because choice of one path will alter possibilities available for further flows, given that they will always follow the momentarily opened fastest routes. So possible flow paths cannot be known in advance. As a collection, flow pathways could be characterized as being vague before the flows occur. An image of this process, it's one I use a lot, would be rainwater trickling down a bare hillside, with some channels disrupting or capturing others, all of them dissipating gravitational potential energy as they go. Vagueness of possibilities aligns naturally with the kind of cause the second law institutes in nature. This is very controversial. It is a final cause. Aristotle's one cause that was eliminated from science by Bacon. In fact, it's the most generally potent finality of any. It requires that energy gradients dissipate as quickly as possible, but provides no specifications beyond urgency. Now we can just eclipse the slides. Is that an empty slide?
That's an empty slide, yes.
Yeah. Good. Now, vagueness has been considered a problem in analytical philosophy and legal discourses, but here I'll model it as pluripotentiality. For examples, as equivocation, it could be created by a deliberate blurring of choice. In modern poetry, with multi-meanings from phrases and so on. Or it could result as ambiguity when a clear image of some situation or thing is for practical reasons impossible to obtain or describe. Or it could be because some object is itself intrinsically vague, as I would say were the opportunities for water flow as that flow had just begun to take place in the example of the rained upon hillside. Other examples of this particular mode of vagueness, because it's interesting, are case 1, choices from a definite array of possibilities, as in a die, when the possibilities are taken all together while the die is in motion. Here the possibilities and outcomes are much more definite than those on the hillside mentioned above, and not very interesting. Case 2, inferences from possibilities become more clear as an inquiry or construction develops, as in a Bayesian process, where a prior estimate leads to a succession of posterior refinements. Here, no definite actuality would be uncovered, but may become increasingly manifest as further experiences or computations proceed, narrowing the variety of possibilities and diminishing the vagueness. This is something like the course to find construction of messages in neurobiology. Apparently that's a commonly used trope. Case 3. Possibilities are all in principle definable and realizable. And there are many of them, many of which may be realized together. Water trickling on the hillside is one example, very simple example. But this is also the situation in an as yet undeveloped embryo, much more interesting, which can be said to be vaguely embodied because we know the forms that will be attained during development, so we can understand embryonic anlage as being vague precursors of the forms that will gradually emerge. In this particular case, the search through possibilities is guided by informational constraints that are held and also generated internally. On the hillside, constraints are generated spontaneously as the process unfolds. In these 3 examples, there can be said to be an actual, intrinsically vague initial situation, which may be clarified by activities appropriate to each case. In the die, the search dynamics have no guidance, and all possibilities have the same likelihood and require the same energetic cost. The finality involved is of little interest here. In the Bayesian type search, finality is realized during a process of construction, continuing until the satisfaction of sufficiency is attained. This may be by way of an external inquiry, by a series of conditional probabilities. Or it may be a process of concrete construction built upon what has already been achieved. Vaguer possibilities are gradually exchanged for an increased degree of realization. The goal here is clarification. In the third case, finality is realized as a quest for becoming. On the hillside, the multiple flowing realizes the finality of entropy production from gravitational energy, second law. While in an embryo, that finality is also present, but the changes are harnessed to a much more immediate one, the attainment of maturity. In biology, the ulterior goal is the burst of activities involved in reproduction. So, finalities can be parsed as follows. The second law is a teleomatic principle. Ernst Mayr invented that term. The functions of living things are also end-directed towards survival and reproduction, as of course are the many purposes of human beings. Our view of the Big Bang can be represented in this way. Is that slide 5?
No, that's slide 1.
Ah.
That's slide 5 in your hand. Yes, right there. No. 4 is up. 5 is the one you just. Yeah, that's 5. Okay.
Ah, the rascal. Well, of course, this is a jerry-rigged.
It's fine. It works.
Yeah. Okay, our view of the Big Bang can be represented in the subsumption hierarchy in this way. Here there is no, in this particular version, there is no, on the top, upfront, obvious suggestion of finality. One realm is only shown emerging from a previously established one. However, following suggestive statements by the American philosopher Charles Peirce, we may use this format to suggest a more finalistic formulation, as in the lower half of this of this slide, we see universal mind. It's a very interesting concept. The realm of universal mind would have been during the so-called dark ages of the matter radiation soup early in the Big Bang. This situation would have been vague in the sense that all possible forms and configurations compatible with physical constraints would momentarily appear anywhere and evaporate, continually replacing each other locally. Some of them might even prefigure future emergences in the higher integrative levels as yet unrealized. An interesting philosophical possibility. One point to make here is that conceptual formats like the subsumption hierarchy can lead our thoughts in certain directions if we are open to the possibilities they present. The finalistic drive in the above universal scene will have been a tendency toward more definite embodiments of material and living systems at increasingly larger scales, an evolutionary tendency. We might note that such tendencies are not accepted until today's evolutionary biology. The role of the second law in all of this will have had to do with the fact that not all energy gradients dissipate spontaneously, as by mass wasting or diffusion. Such gradients are, however, susceptible to the actions of dissipative structures. And these would be tornadoes, waves, and even very refractory ones can yield to the activities of living systems. That is, the evolutionary tendency of biology on Earth toward larger and more complex forms, and one might add engineering feats, can be viewed as elicited by the second law, so as to produce a plenitude of ever more effective dissipative structures. Terrible phrase from the point of view of science, the way it is now. Summarizing, we found that explanation by way of subsumption under a covering law opened up the possibility of a causal explanation by reversing the process. In the particular case examined, the causality could be seen to be finalistic. This could easily be mapped to developmental processes generally. Interesting idea. Whereby initially vague possibilities will unfold into ever more definite embodiments by way of the emergence of new informational constraints. Thank you for your attention.
Good. Now I get to ask you some questions while you're standing there.
Great.
Okay. So Bill Wimsatt, when I filmed him, he suggested that the most important characteristic of explanation is robustness. And the way he's using robustness, it would seem that under your formulation, vague tendencies which lead to embodiments are more robust than any particularization which has indeed been embodied.
In advance, embodied.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. In fact, I think vagueness is a very rich idea and has been just rejected by the search for clarity within both legal and analytic philosophy regimes. Well, I agree. I can't agree more.
Talk a little more about vagueness, please. Anything you want to say about vagueness?
Well, I think it's the mother of everything. I think everything begins vague. And of course, an embryo is a very nice example. Let's think of, what about tendencies towards warfare? We have some geopolitical, we have some economic things which are shifting around, and if it hasn't happened yet, you might not think that they will have an effect that could lead to a war. Actually, I've been on a discussion list just now where I'm trying to suggest that a society, a culture, has implicit structures. Now, these implicit structures are vague, obviously, because they don't say do this, don't do that. And I've been arguing with a well-known scientist who claims that famous scientists really invented something new that no one expected. In other words, he used a couple of names. Hertz. You folks may have heard that name. Apparently was ingenious in thinking up new ways to look at the world, categorize it. Well, my argument is that he did not spring from nowhere. There must have been vague tendencies within the culture which invited such a thought, but it may never have been realized. This guy was really bright. Hertz is bright. He could think outside the box. That's something that everyone likes. Well, no, maybe not everyone. I don't think you can think outside the box. The box is vague, however, and certain kinds of thoughts will be rejected, even by the guy who might have them. But if not by him, certainly his colleagues. They'll say, gee, you know, that's an interesting idea. Let's pass on to the next. They may not even punish him for this. They just say, well, let's move on to another thing. So, and I find this heated hatred of this notion. People like the idea that individual human beings can move a whole culture, and I'm saying no. It's not a sensible idea at all. The culture is ready for something to happen, which, by the way, is a very good. I don't know if I can think of them at this point, but there are many examples of simultaneous inventions of ideas. I'm sure you could. This is what I expect from any vague system. It's not that it doesn't have any lineaments at all, but the vagueness, you could say it's creative. It could elicit, it could call for certain kinds of ideas. It will also suppress other kinds of ideas. And so, I'm not sure, I guess there's a term for this vague cultural structure. I'm not sure structure is even a good word. Possibilities, a nexus of possibilities, and that's also negative. There's certain possibilities will not be followed, will not be realized. So, I think that's, I mean, can you ask further?
Of course. So, would you distinguish between your use of the word vague, other people's use of the word ambiguous, and still the more, shall we say, hard scientists and probabilistic people's use of the word uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I did address ambiguity in the paper. As I understand it in information theory, ambiguity is what you get coming through the wire. It's been fuzzified by the just by molecular. But that's not the only. I find much more interesting was a word that I always I hate to yes, equivocation. That is much more interesting. And I never can remember that word. Equivocation originates at the source of the message, rather than accumulating it as ambiguity does. So, from that point of view, I think we can have a pretty clear idea of those two sources of what was the phrase you used, the last?
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty. Source of uncertainty. Yes, the reduction of uncertainty can be, I think, a general philosophical notion. It doesn't have to be information theoretic. And I have a tendency to, or I have argued, that a reduction of uncertainty can be very problematic when the seeker of certainty goes out to search. I think there is a real possibility of that seeker disturbing the system that's being searched, so that uncertainty can be reduced. So I have formulated the idea that for a system that is seeking to reduce uncertainty in its environment by various searches, it can't happen. The searches themselves will create more uncertainty, and so that you're always working, like for example, the second law is that entropy, or some people call disorder, cannot be reduced in an isolated, thermodynamically isolated system. So what I was saying is that informational entropy, or information carrying capacity, cannot be reduced for a searcher. It cannot be reduced in its environment for a searcher trying to reduce it. So that this was in connection with people arguing that informational entropy, there's no law stating that it has to be, it must be increased. And it's the same thing with the second law. The statement is that the entropy must increase in an isolated system. So I thought, well, informational entropy must increase in what kind of system? There must be a system where informational entropy must always increase. And that was my solution to that. That is, that the searcher seeking to reduce informational entropy winds up not being able to do it, creating more disorder, if you like, during these searches. And this brings up, yes, related to vagueness, something I've argued recently. Our culture could be argued focuses strongly upon focus. A problem, solve the problem. Focus. Kids in school are learned to focus and solve that arithmetic problem, or look for a better way to state it. Look for a more clear way to state this statement. My argument is that one of the large deficiencies of our culture is a lack of even awareness of peripheral awareness. They don't encourage it. They don't think about it. They don't write. Well, I imagine, yeah, there are gurus who probably write about this. Eastern philosophies. I remember in those Don Juan stories by, forgotten his name now.
Carlos Castaneda.
Yeah, Castaneda. Don Juan was always emphasizing peripheral awareness. In fact, when I used to walk to work while I was reading that, I would try not to focus on where I was going, but only on, because you could do this in a city street. It's easier than in a forest, but well, you can do it in the forest. I've done it. So, it's a viewpoint that is not encouraged by what I would call our cultural nexus of possibilities. It's not that it's impossible, it's not encouraged. I mean, can you imagine a physicist writing on paper which has not to do with finding a solution to a certain thing, but rather focusing on well, yeah, you could state it well. Rather than solving the equation, you focus on the values of the constants in the equation. And I think some of the chaos people actually did that. They changed the constants in the equation, and they saw the results of doing that, rather than solving the equation for different values of x. And so there actually was some playing around with that. I haven't followed chaos theory very much. It doesn't seem to come up in my thinking very much, but that I think is an example. In other words, see, I'm not saying that things that go against the cultural tendency cannot happen. They can happen. And they might even be accepted, like for fun. I mean, chaos theory was a lot of fun. You know, the butterfly in China had a big effect on the forests in Canada or something like that. Had lots of fun. Somehow I feel it's kind of was left at that. It wasn't really pursued very much beyond that. So I think one could make an interesting example out of that. So I've lost the thread, so you can ask another question.
How would we go about teaching better awareness of the periphery, of the vague, and of equivocation?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, some of that's pretty obvious. I mean, if you want to teach information theory, which I think could be placed in a kind of general setting, so that it's not necessarily about science. It could be, well, actually, you could teach poetry that way. You could show how, in fact, what's it called, back in the 40s and 50s, when I started reading poetry, that there was the school that was in ascendancy then was the New Criticism. And the New Criticism eschewed talking about the emotions involved or the history of the poet or anything like that. Just look at the structure of the poem And when you take that view of the poem, you become aware of connotations. Now, connotations are, in fact, peripheral awarenesses. Now, each word has a denotation, but it may be the connotations that are driving the argument. So that you might say, this guy's trying to deliberately mislead you, but if you realize that you've been misled and understand how it was done, and I'm sure we could start talking about that nasty topic, ads on TV, some of which are very clever, ads anywhere, I guess. I think there's a lot of, they're relying on peripheral suggestions rather than, or maybe both. I mean, sure, they're trying to sell a product, but they're making it attractive by having these peripheral suggestions. Now, final course comes in here too. I used to write some poetry. I have a little booklet. I should give you a copy. The subject of the poem is not up front in the denotations of the words, and so I would have the students do some poetry, at least certain schools of poetry. Today, I glance at it in the New Yorker, and I'm never very impressed. I don't know. It's just a blind spot of mine. It's the way they tend to talk. Very self-oriented, weeping, unhappy, worried about the world. Who could blame them? I mean, you know, so. But I think the terms in information theory could be used in connection with understanding poetry. Then, of course, this also abuts on political rhetoric, where the politicians are, you might say they are trying to do a type of poetry. And there too, well, the way they present themselves and so on, I mean, they may get together and discuss whether we should go to war, but each one has presented himself in a certain way so that you would more likely believe what that person thinks. So here's where you can see vagueness comes into all of this, and finality comes into all this. There's always some, it may not be a clear goal, but there's some tendency where it's drifting towards. So, well, so ask another one.
All right. So, is there room for vagueness in a good explanation?
Well, see, that you're using the word good pejoratively. Or well, I would say it's being used. You're trying to get at. I mean, a good explanation in science is quantitative. Actually, this came up recently too. There is such a thing as qualitative argument in science and physics. For example, you could say that as you modify x, y changes as a bowed curve, or the opposite, or whatever. Now that's a fairly vague statement from the point of view of an engineer. However, they may want to start with that. I mean, that's the image you can get in your mind. How y changes with respect to x. under certain circumstances, and then you can plug in various constants, and you could show the kids how constants affect the result, and you could have vague constants in the sense of what do they call it? Recursive constants. So you don't really know what the value of that will be later on. You've got some kind of recursive thing which is generating. So yeah, I think I think these ideas that I have been playing around with here, what were they? Vagueness, final cause. There was another one. There was another one. What happened to it? Well, I don't know if I should waste time.
Well, don't worry about it. I'm gonna edit the tape, so you can do what you need.
Yeah. Well, those were the two. No,
Yeah.
I somehow I have an idea there was a third.
Particularization?
Which?
Particularization?
Well, yeah, that's the developmental process.
Yeah.
I think of that in terms of, yeah, the developmental process. And I use, the term that I like to use for that is developmental systems theory. And I was very unhappy to see that a group of, I guess you'd say, critics of the neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, and I agree with their criticism, picked up the term developmental systems theory, but their intent was rather postmodern in the sense of one of them gave a talk in which she criticized the word development, and then criticized the word systems, and then criticized the word theory. To me, if you're going to call something developmental systems theory, it should really be something more of a theory rather than mere dialectic criticism, which is fine. I mean, I'm nothing against that. Certainly, neo-Darwinism deserves criticism, and I do that myself, off and on. Anyway, so I like this term developmental systems theory. It's basically, things start vague and they become ever more definite in ways that I gave several examples in the paper. And that has really not been picked up. Well, there are areas, for example, I really haven't thought much about systems theory for quite a while. So how do I really know that someone hasn't picked up on this developmental, on this approach of vague to definite? I really can't say that I don't know that. I've been much more involved in the systems theory aspects with hierarchy theory. I recently published a paper on that, which I don't know if I sent you a copy or not, but I will. I'll send you a copy. And hierarchy theory is pretty definite. It doesn't have anything to do much with vague. I mean, it's a logical format. And another thing I've been doing a lot lately, which does have quite a bit to do with vagueness, is semiotics. So, Peircean semiotics. And there's a very strong school going on in Europe of this at the moment. You're probably aware of that. And well, you're talking about interpretation, this system of interpretation. And I always like to argue that the interpretations depend very much upon the system that's doing the interpretation, and that system constructs the signs that are used and changes the signs due to further investigations. Yeah, semiotics is a good realm, and I'm trying to urge that among they have a pretty good active discussion group now. So I've been tending to make flagrant statements to initiate reactions, and so far I guess mostly I've gotten a sense that, well, that's amusing, but I won't deal with it at the moment. But that's an upcoming field. And the thing is, they are trying to invade biology, and so they've coined the term biosemiotics. And I have sort of questioned. I mean, you could make interesting semiotic analysis of any biological system, easily done. But I don't think they're going to invade biology or have much of an effect on biology unless they can suggest something that no one else could have suggested, which leads to a breakthrough. And I suppose they would like to think that they could do that. My interest in it is as a critique of science. Because, see, science basically is based on dyadic interactions. You know, the old Newtonian effect, an equal and opposite effect. It's a dyadic concept, and all throughout it's basically dyadic that way. Whereas Peircean semiotics is triadic. And the way I would think of it in terms of science is you could have a semiotic system just like that hillside. In fact, I published this, an example of that hillside, making it semiotic, or I thought making it semiotic, where the context will, some particular aspect of the context will change the equal and opposite interaction and spin it off in a little different way. If you have that, then you have a triadic situation. It seems to me that if you try and push that into science, it sort of upsets the whole thing. I mean, it isn't that. There are many scientists who are well aware of context. I mean, ecologists, for example. I guess they study only context, if you like. So I'm not saying science is not interested in or hasn't explored contextual things, but the fundamental interactions in natural science are basically dyadic. I guess, you know, that the graph of x and y, we've seen XYZ graphs, and so it isn't that those are not constructed, but I wonder if and how early they're introduced in science classes in high school. I mean, a lot of this stuff is not so, is really pertinent to teaching, probably, more than anything else. I don't happen to be that interested in that sort of teaching myself. I'm too selfish. I like to play with ideas. So, but I think that, but probably you would not be allowed to change the curriculum, because now they have all this, these standardized tests that everyone has to pass. I mean, this is, you're just destroying education with this kind of stuff, because you're not allowing a brilliant teacher to really connect with the kids. I mean, in my own teaching experiences, I guess the most relevant experience I had was when I taught evolution. I had, halfway through, I had already become very suspicious of the neo-Darwinian formulations and so on. And so while I taught it, I deconstructed it at the same time. Lots of kids did not do well with this, but the really bright kids did. And I was pleased to see there were even some kids from the ghetto. In fact, they would not have liked the straight presentation. They liked my presentation. They got A's in the course. So, yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is not out there as what is being taught. And this again goes to the cultural nexus. What they want to do, they want to solve problems, not realizing that every time you solve a problem you create 10 more. Our destruction of the natural environment, which is growing apace. I'm on an environmentalist list. I can't believe the stuff that comes across there every day. I mean, if I wasn't 83 and not expecting to last more than another 5 years anyway, I would be really frightened by this stuff. As it is, I'm just saying, what can you do? The hell with it. I'm out of here. You guys want to screw up the world? Do it.
All right, so I'm going to switch topics on you a little bit, but
Sure.
It's only a little bit. One of our speakers is going to be talking about creationism
Oh, yeah.
and intelligent design.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's fine. I've written a book review of what some folks have been saying is the most intelligent and educated of the it's not creationist.
Intelligent.
Yes, ID. A very well written book by a geologist. I think a historical geologist. And I'll have to send you a copy of that. So I'm well aware of this whole business, and I can tell you my reply to this interaction between evolutionary biologists and intelligent designers. And that is that it really does follow from what we've been saying. Scientists have constructed their theories and objects that they study in the most explicit possible way. In fact, one could say that they are mechanists or mechanicists. Science, natural science, is a mechanistic discipline. Well, if you're talking about mechanisms, then they have designs. And if there are designs, why the hell can't you think of a designer? I mean, it's people who design machines. And if nature is a machine, well then hell, there must be a design. I mean, not must be. It's not totally implausible that there's a designer. So my review is hitting the scientists and the ideas at the same time. That's my main feeling about intelligent design is that it's not illogical. I don't like it. I think we don't really need religion pushing into other areas, as it were. Very pernicious effects can come from this. But as far as idea is concerned, it's a logical consequence if you happen to want to believe in a personal God. Did you have something other in mind specifically?
Well, our speaker has spent the past 5 years leading the charge to get rid of the creationist textbooks in Louisiana schools.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
So whatever commentary you can supply there.
Yeah.
Because remember, that argument is that evolution is just a theory. So therefore, why don't we teach creationism? It's the Word of God.
Right. Good. Because I even wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper concerning this. What people need to know clearly is that evolution is... What is evolution? Evolution is a conclusion drawn. It's not a process. It's a conclusion drawn from the studies of many fields. Many. In my letter, I listed 10 different fields that have contributed to the concept of evolution. So it's kind of a notion that it's really hard to escape if you know anything about intellectual pursuits. But I would add a little coda here. Even when I was a 10 or 12-year-old kid on a farm, I used to make pets of the chickens and stuff and play with them. And I used to take the chicken's leg, and I would look at my hand, and I would look at the chicken's leg. You know, and I don't know what it was, but I realized that there must be some relationship between these. Well, of course, creationists could handle that too, I suppose. Intelligent designer could handle that. But anyway, that's just speaking to the idea that what is evolution? Well, it's not a process. It is an inference drawn from many studies. What do evolutionary biologists teach? Well, they'll introduce that first. Then they teach the neo-Darwinian version of Darwin's natural selection. And that needs to be proposed as the current theory of selection. Very different from the inference of a process. This is a current theory used to explain it. And now, of course, there are so many ways of showing that it's inadequate. Especially inadequate was to focus on random mutations as causing change. Now, with the field of evo-devo, they're now investigating how new things actually emerge in embryos. And coupling that with the idea that a successful new individual thing can actually be fed back to the genes. That is total dynamite. Then if that individual is successful in reproduction, it has been shown its offspring. So now you have Lamarck is back on the scene. So, well, regardless of whether we like the neo-Darwinian thing or we want to be more Lamarckian, so we have to make the distinction between, I mean, evolution is not a theory, it's an inference. There is a theory, and it's a very weak theory. And yet, the people who hold that theory and teach it in their classes, they believe it. So this then goes back to an attack that was made on them in the late 70s and early 80s by systematic biologists. And the idea was that natural selection is hardly ever tested. It's just assumed. In fact, you could boil it all down by saying it's a research program. Well, a research program does not test the principles on which the research program is based. It tests other things which would devolve out of that. So, in fact, I began getting annoyed with evolutionary biologists because I had published a very nice study demonstrating the probable existence of natural selection using measurements on frogs. And it was totally ignored. I started out by saying if what I'm looking for here is not the case, then natural selection is false. It's been tested. Well, it turns out that the results are consistent with natural selection. Nevertheless, it was ignored and has never been cited, as far as I know, by anyone, even in 5 or 6 books that I saw that related to selection in natural populations, which this study was. Well, so that got me pissed off. And I realized that, well, you know, here's the structure of the discourse. As a colleague of mine said, what's important in evolutionary biology comes out of Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or University of California. Anything else might come to someone's attention, but it will not be pushed. It will not really. So we have here the social structure of social interactions of science and so on. Anyway, that got me mad, so I started looking in detail. What were the weaknesses of the natural selection argument, which I boiled down to something I never would expect ever to get published, but it's on my web pages, Critique of Natural Selection. So, I don't know if that answered that question, or
Yep. All right, so last but not least, the people you're speaking to via videotape are attending a conference on explanation. Do you have any words of wisdom for them?
Explanation. Well, my paper is, you know, about using the covering law as a mode of explanation.
Yes. Well, as I said, it's just words of wisdom. This is sort of like a little snippet that I'm going to stick someplace on the website.
Yeah, oh, I see. Well,
We're giving you the opportunity to invent a Stan Salty trope.
boy, I'll tell you, I mean, everything, well, okay, well, I mean, this is maybe a little deconstruction, but we may think that science is concerned with explaining phenomena, but given our social nexus, I think it's more about looking for ways to control nature, not to explain it. They don't need an explanation. They want to know how they can grab it by the throat and wring something out of it that's useful. And useful could be interpreted in many different ways. And I think maybe that if I have made an explanation involving vagueness, I may not be able to use that very much. Is that one reason why that may not be a very popular way of looking at things? Well, anyway, probably Bill Wimsatt would have something more interesting to say about that. Yeah, I mean, I would explain, for example, partial explanation of why there are organisms I gave in the paper is that the universe requires them to break up rocks and stir up the mud and get things put out there so that they can be dissipated. Now, if the second law is false, and if this is not an expanding universe, and so on, that may be irrelevant. In other words, that idea depends on our view of the universe. Is it an expanding universe? Is it increasingly out of equilibrium? So that, in other words, there are types of explanations. This one that I'm using depends on other concepts being accepted. In other words, I think explanation is always in the context of a discourse, a research program. What explanation is accepted depends on what is the research program in which discourse. So, I mean, it's like something I encountered when I was a teenager. Supposing we have several people looking at a forest. One of them is a poet, the other is a hunter, the other is a lumberman. They all have totally different criteria when they see the forest. Their minds start turning. And so an explanation is only an explanation in the context of, let's call it a research program, or an enterprise, if you like. That's what I would say, yeah.
Perfect.
I guess I worked my way towards what would be needed there.
It's great. We're there. Perfect.
Okay, I mean, I have to tell you, I haven't given a talk or attended a conference for over more than 12 years, I think. I just can't hack the traveling and being away from what makes me comfortable. So, I don't know, I suppose it went pretty well considering that. What's that old joke? Unused as I am to giving a speech, and then the guy goes on.
Exactly. Okay, now how if I can get it to do what it's supposed to do?
You got it?
Well, it doesn't want to shut off, so 1 second.
You have to shut it off.